My name is Nick Larigakis. I'm president of the American Hellenic Institute, and it is a pleasure to welcome you here today to another edition of our noon forum, as I mentioned, on the aforementioned topic of the Smyrna catastrophe. Before I begin, let me recognize some individuals in the room here today, and in no particular protocol order, but I'm going to just go down the list in alphabetical order. And that's Dimitris Angelosopoulos, who is the counselor with the Embassy of Greece, representing the ambassador, and we thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Also, we have with us Lieutenant Colonel George Ioannou, the Defense Attaché of the Embassy of Cyprus, and we congratulate the government of Cyprus for being implementing a Defense Attaché here in Washington, and we congratulate you for being here, and we look forward to continuing working with you. None other than our close friend, Colonel Vasilis Lambropoulos, the Defense Attaché of the Embassy of Greece, but who is also officially representing the Chief of the Hellenic National Defense General Staff, General Christos Christodoulou. So we thank you for being here, Colonel. And Nikolaos Papadopoulos, Counselor, Head of Public Diplomacy Office, and Press Counselor, heads the press office here at the Embassy of Greece, and only been here within the last couple of months, so we welcome you and thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much.
As I said, on behalf of AHI, our nonprofit independent Greek-American Public Policy Center, it is my pleasure to present our noon forum in commemoration of the 97th anniversary of the Smyrna catastrophe, titled Correcting 3 Popular Misconceptions About the 1922 Catastrophe in Smyrna. Sadly, the tragic events of August and September of 1922, where countless Greeks of Asia Minor were murdered, occurred during the era of the Armenian Genocide and the broader genocidal campaign by the Ottomans against Greeks, Pontians, Assyrians, and other Christian communities. The once robust city of Smyrna, which at the time was thriving center of Greek culture, was obliterated. The catastrophic events of 1922 are important to commemorate because they remind us of man's inhumanity to man. Unfortunately, we continue to see egregious human rights tragedies and genocides continue to occur in the world today, just as they did in Smyrna in 1922. Just take a moment to reflect upon the atrocities being committed against Christians in the Middle East almost on a routine basis every day. Back in 1922, governments stood idle. They failed to act. And pausing for a moment to take time out of our busy schedules to remember Smyrna, we hope we are taking a step to halt this plague of human rights abuses and genocide that still exists, unfortunately, now well into the 21st century. Therefore, we are very pleased to feature our guest speaker today to help us not only commemorate Smyrna, but to correct a few misconceptions about that catastrophe. And that is, of course, Professor Ismini Lam, Director of the Modern Greek Studies program at Georgetown University. And to introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to call on our AHI board member, James Marketos, who himself traces his family roots back to Smyrna, and who himself has presented from this podium on this commemoration, and who has written and presented prolifically on this particular issue, and he's very well versed in this issue. So it gives me great pleasure to invite our board member, Mr. Marketos, who will introduce our guest speaker.
It's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Lam, and I'm very much looking forward to her remarks. As Nick mentioned, she's the director of the Georgetown Greek Studies, Modern Greek Studies program, and for over 27 years with that program, Ismini has been cultivating the appreciation of our future leaders for everything Greek. Not only does she teach all levels of modern Greek, she also teaches a wide range of interdisciplinary courses on Greek culture, subjects like media and film, Byzantine history and civilization, the Orthodox faith, and Greek business culture. Her research interests include social and humanitarian issues in contemporary Greece, particularly with the advent of the financial and refugee crises. Especially relevant to our gathering today, she's writing a biography of George Horton, the American Philhellene, classicist, author, diplomat and humanitarian who played an important role in the last days of Greek Smyrna. Nick has already referred to what happened in Smyrna in 1922. I'm not going to say anything more about the historical events because I'm looking forward to learning what Professor Lamb is going to tell us about them and the details she'll bring to our attention. But indulge me for just a moment to reflect on a simple question, and that is, why are we here? Why do we do this every year? And reflect on something that happened far away nearly a century ago. Well, Nick gave you the answer. It's because what happened there so long ago is still very relevant today. And I'll give you some proof. Just a little more than a month ago, on August 30, Greek and Turkish pro soccer teams were playing against each other in Trabzon, Turkey. The Greeks, of course, call it Trabzonspor. In English, it's Trebizond. The Greek team was AHI, A-E-K, which in English translates to the Athletic Union of Constantinople. Well, the team was formed in Athens in 1924, just 2 years after the events we're going to hear about in a few moments. In the stadium, some Turkish fans held up a large sign, a banner really, and it had to be 15 to 20 yards long and more than a yard tall. And it was in English, and they held it up toward the Greek AHI fans on the opposite side of the stadium. In huge block letters, each one almost the size of an adult, the banner asked, "Can you swim?" That question is a hateful, mocking reference to the 1922 genocide perpetrated against Greeks and others by Turks in Smyrna. If you don't get the reference already, you will after Ismini speaks. The banner proves that the hatred that sparked a gruesome seaside Holocaust still burns today. That's why we do this every year. We remember Smyrna so that the world doesn't forget Smyrna. We remember Smyrna because Turkey needs to learn about Smyrna and to acknowledge what really happened there in 1922 and to stop blaming it on others or denying it altogether. We don't do this out of hatred. We don't seek retribution. We remember Smyrna for the sake of simple justice, to set the record straight. We don't ask this because we're Greeks or Greek Americans. We ask it as human beings. We simply ask Turkey to acknowledge the truth, to recognize the genocide for what it was, and we will continue to remember Smyrna, and we will continue to demand recognition of the truth until Turkey does what is right. Please welcome Professor Ismini Lamb.
Hello, I am deeply honored to be invited to speak at the American Hellenic Institute today, and thank you for your kind introduction. It means a lot to me coming from you because I know you're someone who appreciates George Horton as much as I do, so thank you very much. And I am especially happy to speak about the Smyrna catastrophe today of 1922 because for the past 6 years I have been researching and writing about someone deeply involved in the catastrophe and its events. And of course I am talking about George Horton, who was the Consul General in Smyrna from 1919 to 1922. And George was present when the events unfolded, and he was an eyewitness as well. Now, I won't tell you very much about George Horton because you introduced him a little bit, but I will tell you that he was a seasoned diplomat and very experienced for almost 30 years in that part of the world in Greece and Turkey, along with being a poet and a journalist and a classicist and a Philhellene and all that. So I must say that George was also a Christian pacifist of sorts, and I'm saying of sorts because he did think democracy worth saving, worth fighting for. And as his career progressed, he also emphasized the need to use some force for humanitarian purposes while on occasion. Well, he's largely forgotten today, but he's still remembered by Armenians and Greeks for saving many lives during that difficult time, the catastrophe of 1922, the destruction of Smyrna. And of course, he's remembered by writing his book, The Blight of Asia. Like Horton, I consider Turkey's abuse of its Christian minorities an established historical fact, as I believe the vast majority of scholars do. And of course, there is a mountain of evidence on this topic, but for my presentation today, I will rely on a couple of recent sources that are particularly illuminating. One of them is Wolfram Guss, and for German speakers, I apologize if that was not the correct pronunciation. His 2014 book, The Armenian Genocide, Evidence from the German Foreign Office Archives, 1915 to 1916. And the second source is Benny Morris and George Zavy, a 2019 book, a very recent book, The 30-Year Genocide, Turkey's Destruction of its Christian Minorities, from 1894 to 1924, for 30 years. Well, while Guss concentrates on the Armenian genocide, Morris and Zavy fully cover the persecution of the other Christian groups, including the mass murder and expulsion of Anatolian Greeks, who literally had lived in Anatolia for thousands of years. By the way, the persecution began prior to the Armenian genocide. And on a related point, both the sources I mentioned exonerate the Ottoman Christians from charges of sedition, as a charge often levied against them by Turkish sources. I also want to mention I have a couple of copies of my presentation for you, and I'll be happy to email them with many footnotes, which are very important. I could not include everything today. You will be here for a very long time, maybe for dinner. It will show how unique and important these sources are. They're very significant. Well, my primary purpose today is to focus more narrowly on the city of Smyrna, and in particular its occupation by Greek forces from 1919 until 1922. And I want to challenge three popular misconceptions about those events. And I would like to argue, first, the Greek occupation of Smyrna was not an act of aggression that gave rise to Turkish nationalism, to the Turkish nationalism movement, and led to the persecution of Christians. Secondly, the subsequent Greek and Turkish atrocities were not at all equivalent in scope, intensity, or intent. And thirdly, that anyone making these points is not automatically an anti-Turkish bigot. Allow me, please, to set the stage for correcting these three misconceptions, and it will help to see the context if you review 5 aspects of the international time prior of the Greek occupation of Smyrna of 1919. First, we must remember, World War I had just ended months earlier. 13 million died in battle during the war, more than twice as many as were killed in all major wars during the previous 100 years. That is a tremendous number. Not surprisingly, the Allied powers expected much in return for their sacrifices. Everything from economic benefits to making the world safer for democracy. Second, one Allied war objective in particular, and I quote, was the liberation of the peoples who now lie beneath the murderous tyranny of the Turks and the expulsion from Europe of the Ottoman Empire, which has proved itself so radically alien to Western civilization. End quote. 3. As casualties mounted, the Allies were increasingly desperate for manpower and willing to promise much in return for nations joining their side, which, among other things, led to competing expectations by Italians and Greeks that they would govern parts of Anatolia. Fourth, By the end of the war, the Allies were largely exhausted and under public pressure to quickly demobilize their armies and bring the boys home for Christmas of 1919. And lastly, the Allies felt they had to give priority to peace with Germany. Germany was by far their most dangerous opponent. It is often forgotten that the Allies had to threaten renewed warfare to get Germany to sign the Treaty of Versailles. American troops stationed in the Rhineland mobilized for this purpose in June of 1919, the month after the Greeks occupied Smyrna. They stood down only when the Germans responded by agreeing to sign the treaty. The upshot of all these factors was a great underlying tension between expansive Allied war goals and their ability to achieve them. One consequence was that, unlike Germany, Turkey was never occupied by large Allied forces or policed by armistice and treaty compliance. With that background, let me turn to the first popular misconception about the Greek occupation of Smyrna, which is that it was an act of aggression that gave rise to the Turkish nationalist movement and the persecution of Christian minorities in Anatolia. In researching the Horton biography, I have read numerous sources that describe the Greek occupation as a quote-unquote invasion, and that they emphasize the Greeks committed gross atrocities that led to the terrible treatment of Christian minorities in Turkey. For example, one such source is Isaiah Friedman's well-regarded book, British Miscalculations, The Rise of Muslim Nationalism 1918 to 1925. And I quote them. The Turks, in their wildest imagination, had not expected that the Greeks would ever invade Smyrna. Even after its occupation, the Turks remained relatively quiescent. Only when the Greeks persisted in their cruelties and continued to burn villages, massacre Turks, rape and murder their womenfolk, and kill their children, did resistance become apparent. End quote. Well, this is all utterly false, as we shall see, but it is not hard to understand why so many people believe it. At the time, virtually all experts on the Ottoman Empire considered sending Greek troops to Smyrna a colossal mistake that would greatly inflame Turkish resistance. Horton certainly was one of those people, and in fact he told Washington that the Greek mission would prove a second Syracusan expedition, referring of course to the disastrous Athenian decision to invade Syracuse in 413 BC. Horton did not think Greece had the resources to succeed, and moreover, he thought putting Greek troops in charge of policing the Turks was a terrible idea for obvious reasons. No nation puts families victimized by criminals in charge of their incarceration, and similarly, experts argued the Allies should not have asked the Greeks to police Smyrna and its environs. The Turks, who despised the Greeks as their underlings, had been heavily persecuting Greeks in the Anatolian littoral throughout the war, even before they launched the Armenian genocide. Giving the Greeks the job of policing Smyrna and its surrounding areas was sure to lead to conflict, as many argued. Thus, many assumed that if the Greeks had not occupied Smyrna, the nationalist movement would not have taken off and Turkish Christian minorities would have been treated better. But that is not true. Let me give you 6 reasons why. And the timeline here is very important because things happen extremely fast, and I have a handout out whenever you, on your way out, please help yourselves to one of those, because the chronology is important. First of all, the Greek occupation of Smyrna was not an act of aggression. It was duly authorized by competent authority consistent with international norms on war termination and in accordance with the terms of Turkey's surrender agreement. Even so, everyone agrees, including most Greeks, that it would have been better to send other forces. So why were the Greeks sent? They were sent because the Italians forced the Allies' leaders' hand. And here is what happened. When Italy did not receive territories in the Adriatic that it wanted, it unilaterally sent Italian forces to Anatolia and was proceeding with plans to occupy Smyrna. To head this off, the Allies felt they had to dispatch a force to Smyrna to counter the Italians. But none of the major powers, Britain, France, and the United States, wanted to use their own troops for this purpose, for reasons we explained earlier. The Greeks were happy to go, in part to put an end to ongoing attacks on Anatolian Greeks, in part to help Anatolian Greeks evicted by the Turks to reclaim their homes and reclaim their abducted family members, and in part because they aspired to eventually take in control of parts of Anatolia heavily populated by Greeks. In short, ladies and gentlemen, the Allies had a dilemma. They didn't want to send the Greeks and knew it was risky, but it seemed worse to have to dispatch their very own troops and absolutely unacceptable to do nothing and simply have the Italians grab parts of Turkey. Thus, the Greeks were sent to Smyrna. It was not an invasion or an act of aggression. The second point is that at the end of formal hostilities in late 1918, the end of the hostilities in 1918 did not put a stop to Turkish persecution of Christian minorities. As Anatolian Greeks struggled to return to their homes after the end of the war, the Turks were still working to expel them. As Morris and Zevi note, the continuous efforts of the Turks to expel more Greeks from Anatolia began before, I repeat, began before the Smyrna landing. The Turks who resisted Allied attempts to return stolen property and abducted women and children again before the Greek occupation of Smyrna. And finally, and again before the Greek occupation of Smyrna, the Turks continued to attack Christian minorities. This ongoing violence against Christians was relatively rare compared to what had gone during the war, but as Morris and Zevi argue, it was telling because it made quote-unquote Turkish intentions clear, even before the Greek landing of Smyrna. The third point is that well before the Greek landing at Smyrna, Turkish leaders were already organizing resistance to the Allied occupation. Historians sometimes state or imply the opposite. One, for example, concludes, and I quote, "The landing of the Greek forces ignited spontaneous resistance in Turkey. Ex-Ottoman soldiers took back the weapons they had laid down under the terms of the armistice." End of quote. In reality, the organization and stockpiling of weapons for resistance were already underway. In fact, immediately following the signing of the armistice agreement, the same leaders who had organized the persecution of Christian minorities during the war began clandestinely stockpiling arms and organizing cadres. The nationalists, as they were called, also set up regional organizations called National Defense or National Rights Committees well before the Greek occupation. Thus, as Mori and Zevi observe, and I quote them, already in March 1919, 2 months before the Greek landing, there was a sense of impending insurrection to be accompanied by slaughter of Christians. Anti-Christian and nationalist revolutionary propaganda were rampant, and Turkish leaders mobilized man-powered and amazed weapons. The Allies were stymied in their efforts to collect guns and ammunition that the Turks were obliged to surrender. End quote. Fourth, the Turks could have peacefully transferred power to Greek authorities. Instead, they set a trap, thus ensuring a bloody occupation of the city. As George Horton often pointed out, the Turks excelled at enforcing order when they wanted to. For example, 6 months before the Greek occupation, right after the Turks signed the armistice with the Allies, there had been joyous celebration in Smyrna that led to drunken revelry and bouts of vandalism. The British asked the Turks to enforce order, and they did so quickly. A diary entry from a British expatriate lady in Smyrna at the time says, I quote, you should have seen how soon the Turks restored order. A few soldiers with fixed bayonets marching through the streets." End quote. That is all it took. The converse was also true. That is, whenever there was public lawlessness against Christians in Turkey, it was usually instigated by Turkish authorities. Yet another point that modern scholarship has substantiated. For example, in anticipation of the arrival of Greek forces, Turkish authorities released the inmates from the local prison, a common Turkish tactic. And the local Turkish Defense Committee made sure the prisoners were armed and ready to resist the occupation. They did so, ambushing arriving Greek forces and precipitating a melee, just as the nationalist Turks had hoped. An Allied commission of inquiry later determined the results were about 160 Greek and 300 to 400 Turkish casualties. Fifth, the bloody mess might have been prevented had the Allies accompanied the Greeks ashore to jointly patrol the city and ensure a peaceful transfer of authority. The Allies were well aware of the local Turkish Self-Defense Committee and the possibility of violence. They knew Nureddin Pasha was planning a hot reception for the Allies. They demanded that he be replaced as the acting Ottoman Governor-General of Smyrna, which happened just days before the arrival of the Greeks. They also carefully considered having the Turkish forts protecting Smyrna turned over to French forces, who then would pass them on to the Greeks. Strangely, however, the Allied naval commanders did not consider it necessary to accompany Greek forces and conduct joint patrols in Smyrna. Horton called the Allied failure to accompany the Greeks ashore for a peaceful transfer of authority the first indication of the lack of united support that ultimately caused the Greek disaster and the destruction of Smyrna. Sixth, the Greek response to Turkish provocation was not a rampage of violence, but a quick restoration of order. In fact, the Greek administration was harder on the Greeks who broke discipline than on the Turks who conspired to instigate the violence. Horton considered this quick restoring of order nothing less than a miracle, given the persecution which the Greeks so recently suffered, particularly since it was accomplished without the help from the Turks or the Allies. The new Greek commissioner, Aristides Steriadis, saw to the quick prosecution of criminals. By the end of the summer, 48 Greeks, 13 Turks, 12 Armenians, and 1 Jew had been found guilty and convicted of crimes taking place following the Greek landing. 3, all Greeks, were quickly executed. Steriadis also made certain looted property was returned to owners, Turks included. For all these reasons, it is clear that the Greek occupation of Smyrna was not an act of aggression. The occupation was permitted under the Mutros Armistice Agreement, but in any case, the Turks were already violating that agreement. Similarly, the Turkish nationalist movement and its persecution of Christian minorities in Anatolia were underway months before the Greek occupation. Therefore, it cannot be argued that the occupation itself precipitated these developments. What then explains the tragic demise of the Anatolian Christians? Simply stated, I think it was the fundamental incompatibility of Allied and Turkish visions for the future of Asia Minor. The Allies' vision was protection of Christian minorities in Turkey and the restitution of their property and family members. In sharp contrast, the Turks were committed to their policy of Turkey for the Turks and determined to resist restitution for their Christian minorities. They followed this policy steadfastly both before the Greeks occupied Smyrna and after they were forced to abandon the city. Given this clash of objectives, the Allies faced a fundamental dilemma. Given that either they had to administer justice at the expense of inflaming Turkish resistance, or that they would have to let things be and effectively reward the Turks for committing genocide and continuing the persecution of Christian minorities. To escape the dilemma, they either had to commit forces to police in Turkey, which was unpopular with their publics, or accept the Turks' policy of Turkey for the Turks. As history records, the Turks were more realistic about this basic dilemma than the Allies, who promoted high hopes without a willingness to sacrifice for them. In this regard, Allied policy was as clear a historical case of paving the road to hell with good intention as the world has ever seen. The Armenians, Greeks, and other Christian minorities who hoped and believed in the Allied promises of justice and democracy were set up for the cruelest of disillusionments. Mustafa Kemal's assessment of President Woodrow Wilson sums it up quite well, I think. Poor Wilson, Kemal said, did not understand that the frontier which is not defended with bayonets, force, and honor cannot be secured by another principle. Many historians acknowledge the failures of Allied idealism, but some have been quick to scapegoat the Greeks, arguing their atrocious behavior in Asia Minor was on a par with that of the Turks, and indeed invited Turkish retaliation in kind. So we come to the second major popular misconception about what happened to Smyrna and Anatolia, more generally. That is, the belief popular in some quarters that atrocities committed by Greeks after landing in Smyrna were roughly equivalent to Turkish atrocities. This is not even remotely true. George Horton referred to assertions that Greek and Turkish atrocities were roughly equal as the 50-50 theory, which he considered absolutely preposterous. He asserted the sheer disparity in power between the Ottoman authorities and their Christian subjects made the argument untenable. Morris and Xavier reviewed allegations of Greek atrocities in detail, but ended up reaching the same conclusion as Horton did. They found that the Greeks deported Turks, looted and torched villages, and occasionally murdered and raped. The Greeks did this in bouts, they conclude, usually linked to Greek military advances or retreats, and to Turkish guerrilla operations and atrocities. The Greek soldiers who committed atrocities were often the Anatolian Greeks and Armenians who had suffered under the Turks for years. Greek atrocities were by definition heinous. However, they were far, far different in scope, intensity, and indeed intent. In terms of scope, Morris and Xavier state categorically that all Western observers agreed that Turkish atrocities against Greeks during 1919-1923 were on a very much greater scale than those committed by the Greeks. But after reviewing the most lurid allegations against the Greeks, Morris and Xavier note that they were almost never confirmed by Western diplomats, missionaries, or journalists. Consequently, Western diplomats came to believe that most Turkish charges were fraudulent, invented to offset Western accusations of Turkish atrocities. The same held true for Turkish allegations of massacres conducted by Armenians. Well, with respect to intensity now, Morris and Xavier argued Greek depredations cannot be compared with the slaughter and sadistic practices of the Turks. To indicate the vast differences, they cite a letter from Turkish notables to the American High Commissioner in Constantinople, Admiral Bristol, claiming, and I quote, misdeeds the likes of which do not exist in the annals of history, end quote. But upon examination, the misdeeds were allegations of house searches and other such impositions. There is no mention of organized massacres or mass rape or mass torture. By comparison, Morris and Xavier found overwhelming evidence that the Turks branded, crucified, burned alive, mutilated, and stoned their victims, and conducted mass rape of both boys and girls. Indeed, these two Israeli scholars reached the chilling conclusion that the Turkish persecution of their Christian minorities was far more sadistic than the Nazi genocide of Jews. Finally, on the critically important question of intent, Morris and Zevi find a major difference between the Greeks and the Turks. In short, the Greeks punished perpetrators of atrocities and the Turks rewarded them. Indeed, as far as is known, Turkish authorities, and I quote, never punished perpetrators of anti-Christian atrocities, and in fact they encouraged, condoned, and rewarded even those guilty of the most appalling atrocities. After reviewing much evidence, Morris and Zevi conclude the most murderous Turks received the greatest rewards, and that Kemal knew how to get the worst out of his subordinates. End of quote. Turkish leaders also punished any righteous Turks who tried to resist the genocide or help persecuted Christians. The great disparity in Greek and Turkish behavior was due to their disparity in power, as Horton noted, but also to their differing objectives. The Greeks were trying to make a case for their ability to govern well and thus win international sympathy for their claim to parts of Anatolia. The Turks had an entirely different goal: ethnic cleansing. They wanted to get rid of the Christians, behaved accordingly, and were successful on a historic scale. Morris and Zevi conclude that with steady oppression, mass murder, attrition, expulsion, and forced conversion, the Turks had, by 1924, cleansed Asia Minor of its 4 million odd Christians. Their words, not mine. Finally, I want to address the third popular misconception, namely, many people seem to think anyone arguing the Greek occupation is not to blame for Turkey's mistreatment of Christian minorities, or that the Greek atrocities are not at all comparable to those of the Turks, must be an anti-Turkish bigot. Well, that's just not true. Ever since the publication of his book, Blight of Asia, almost 100 years ago, George Horton has been condemned, in some circles anyway, as an anti-Turkish bigot. After studying his life at length, I am convinced he was nothing of the kind. Webster's definition of a bigot is someone who is obstinately or intolerantly devoted to his or her own opinions and prejudices, especially someone who regards or treats the members of a racial or ethnic group with hatred and intolerance. Horton was not obstinate or incapable of learning and changing his views, or intolerant of other groups, or even full of hatred. Throughout his career, he helped Muslims in need, including Turks, and admired some aspects of Turkish culture, particularly their heroic stoicism, along with their general hospitality and kindness. But when Turks were whipped into a frenzy of Christian massacres by their leaders, Horton called them out for it, even though doing so effectively ended his diplomatic career. However, as I have tried to demonstrate in this presentation, the best, most recent scholarship now agrees with Horton's conclusion about the scope, intensity, and intent of Turkey's persecution of its Christian minorities. In my view, best scholarship also agrees with his conclusions about the comparatively benign Greek occupation of Smyrna. As a result, I will go as far as to say history, or at least some historians, owe George Horton an apology. Beyond that, I would say that George Horton's view of a better future for Turkey has more merit than what actually transpired. Horton believed Turkey would be better off with an ethnically and religiously diverse population with common rights and civil liberties and representative government. He thought Christian Moors would help elevate Turkey, and that Turks would benefit from remorse, recompense, and restitution for their persecution of their Christians. In other words, he thought the Turkish policy of Turkey for the Turks was a mistake, not just for the Christian minorities, but for the Turks themselves. Turkish leaders had another vision. one of an ethnically and religiously homogeneous nation with secure borders as far as their military might could reach. They realized that vision, but that does not make Horton a bigot for saying Turkey would have benefited from more diversity and tolerance. In closing, I would like to make a personal statement, if I may. Recently, I was subjected to the same name-calling George Horton received. About a month ago, someone from the Federation of Turkish American Associations began a letter campaign protesting this presentation and a similar one I made to New York, and asking the president of Georgetown University to fire me. His letters accused me of promoting propaganda and racial hatred. Happily, Georgetown disagreed and decided to defend scholarship and free speech. Even so, many who believe that evidence clearly indicates genocide took place still wonder whether we wouldn't all be better off if this deeply emotional and tragic subject was swept under the rug, so to speak. We could have bygones be bygone. My response to this is twofold. First, George Horton lived through this genocide he described, and he was profoundly affected by it. As his biographer, I have to address that. Second, and more importantly, I have come to believe it is important to acknowledge genocide for another reason: healing. Victims need to forgive to free themselves from the chains of revenge. As Nazi victim Corrie ten Boom has said, to forgive is to set the prisoner free and discover the prisoner was you. It is also good for the perpetrators to be forgiven insofar as this might encourage them to do better in the future. But how can there be forgiveness without repentance, or repentance without honesty about what has actually happened? I think this is why genocide scholars attach such importance to truth commissions and testimonies of past genocides. They sometimes compare Germany, which was forced to confront its attempted genocide of Jews and other people they considered undesirable, with other countries, for example Japan, that committed horrible atrocities in the world wars but have not yet fully acknowledged those facts. Such comparisons indicate the world is more likely to avoid genocidal behaviors in the future if we insist on the truth about the genocides that have taken place in the past. And ladies and gentlemen, that includes Turkey's genocide of its Christian minorities. This concludes my presentation, and I thank you for your attention.
Can you explain Ataturk's position in the decision-making process? I often hear that, well, he was just following orders kind of thing, which we always hear that in these situations. I'm rather tend to believe that these were his orders, that he made the decision to do it. Can you confirm or deny that?
I would tend to confirm that because history has shown that he was indeed involved, and the genocide was indeed orchestrated by the Turkish authorities, and he was the ultimate authority, I would think. And I would agree with you that yes, indeed, it was. He was aware of it and helped direct it.
Turkey, I think until recently, at least it was a criminal act to even mention genocide, much less even, discuss it openly. But there are cracks in Turkish society about that. In Greece, on the other hand, I think this is something my mother-in-law said, Nikos Filis, who was a minister, denied that it was a genocide. And so there was this different opinion, by some people in Greece about what all that meant to Greece, or at least some people in Greece. So I'm just curious, how do you see people on both sides, both in Greece and in Turkey, viewing this to the extent that they think about it?
Well, I think the kind of information you have and you have access to will inform your opinion. And we definitely have a disparity here because in the Turkish realm there is no such thing as accepted genocide. Definitely the Armenian was a genocide. The Greek, you can call it ethnic cleansing if you do not want to go as far as genocide. There are varied opinions, obviously, on that. And the Greeks are well aware of it, although, again, truth, honesty, and having the facts, nothing but the facts, is extremely helpful because I don't think sometimes, Nick, we have them even in Greece. Even people in Greece will come and tell me, well, you know, the Greeks did terrible things and that's why the Turks did that. So I know, I was shocked. It's not the most common thing you hear, but occasionally you do hear that. And we know our history in Greece, so we do a pretty good job about that. But I think the key is to find a unified approach on making it known on an international scale and bring awareness.
We just noticed once again the Yavuz sailing off the coast of Cyprus, and Cyprus is exclusive economic zone in violation of international law, and there is condemnation. But we observe, and as long as we keep observing, we're going to continue to have these problems. The United States cannot be a bystander observer when it comes to some of these issues, and especially when it comes to the country of Turkey. And more specifically because they are part of NATO. This is not Iran we're talking about. This is not Russia. Okay, this is not some Middle East country, okay, that we don't necessarily have relations with. This is a country we do have items to be able to bring to bear and to bring some pressure. And until we stop appeasement, these things will continue to happen and escalate further. And if you think right now things are easy in the Eastern Mediterranean, they are not. The tensions are running extremely high, and we just hope, okay, that ultimately they will not increase in a much more difficult situation. So we need to stop observing, start making some serious comments, and as me say, which I'm a true believer in this, we need from time to shoot one across the bow, okay, and to make sure, okay, that we understand what's going on here and we're not going to take it. So, on those notes, I thank you once again for being here today and participating in our noon forum of this commemoration. And as we must never forgetting and continue to make sure others don't forget and continue to bring awareness of this and other such issues, so we make sure they don't repeat themselves.